Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Nicolai Foss, who is a professor at the Copenhagen Business School and also the co-author of this new book. It's called Why Managers Matter, The Perils of the Bossless Company. Welcome, Nicolai.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Greg.
Well, look, sometimes I wonder, when I see this title, the Perils of the Bossless Company, I wonder if you are slaying imaginary dragons, right? Because, does anybody actually believe that we could live in a world without bosses? I think you and I both spend a lot of our time in business school. In fact, I think almost every business school professor is either explicitly or implicitly discussing the issues of theory of the firm, right? And I know maybe some people don't realize it, but this is something that you refer to as, classical management education, right? And you also talk about how maybe it's on the decline or on the way out. And I'm wondering if the kind of phasing out of this classical management education has anything to do with this fantasy of the bossless corporation. Are these two things related in some ways? There is sort of a normative idea that is driving this, positive fantasy.
That's a great question, and I think there's a lot to what you're saying. It is indeed a fantasy. Because the proper question, of course, is how many bosses should we have? What should they do? How much should they delegate? What should be the reach of their authority? What is the proper span of control? And so on and so forth. These are the real questions, right? But I think these are also only questions that you can truly comprehend and address and answer if you have been exposed to what you called, was it classical management education? I mean, classical organization theory, Martin Simon, Thompson, Galbraith, transaction cost economics, principal agent theory, those kind of things that essentially talk about the fundamental things that managers do, right? They coordinate, they make us cooperate, because at the end of the day, organization is about coordinated cooperation. And the right question to ask is, what exactly is the role of managers in bringing about coordinated cooperation? And if you don't pose it this way, people drink the let's fire all the bosses Kool-Aid, right? So at least some do. That's the title, by the way, of a Harvard Business Review article by Gary Hamel. First, let's fire all the bosses. Right. So some people, in fact, do explicitly call for firing all the bosses.
Yeah,
I'm not sure. And if you read that article, he's not that literal. So I think very, very few people would be prepared to defend 100% bosslessness.
Well, I mean, is there maybe some confusion here? Because when I teach the theory of the firm in my strategy class, and I used to have an entire class on these topics, we talk about two different things. One is sort of firms versus markets, right? And where the boundaries of the firm end and market transactions begin. And then the other is within the firm, how centralized and how decentralized are you? And these are related topics, but they're different. And so are people sort of observing the greater flatness of organizations and mistaking it for the kind of, eradication of hierarchy?
I think that's true also. It's probably the case that, at least among the big US corporations, we've seen a lot of flattening in the sense of delayering. There's extremely solid research by, for example, Julie Wolf of Harvard Business School and others that show this to be the case. And we also know that firm size, even worldwide, seems to have been declining over the last decades. But of course, that's not the same as bosslessness. But you are absolutely right to raise the point, because very often flat hierarchies become almost synonymous for bosslessness. And I think that is, you know, I can see where people are coming from when they make that inference, but I don't think it's correct at all. So what Wolf's research, for example, shows is that big companies typically delayer in order to bring top managers closer to operations, to increase the span of control, to increase their opportunities for, well, meddling is not the right word perhaps, but let's intervening in the affairs of subordinates and lower layers in the hierarchy. And one of the things that indicate that this is probably what's going on is that Wolf also finds that while companies are delayering, they are also increasing the size of the top management teams. So it is, delayering may be accompanied by less decentralization and less delegation, and more direct hands-on management, even perhaps more micromanagement.
Well, I mean,
so
are these firms?
Just not confuse the two. They are very different things.
Well, I mean, so maybe tell me the evidence about firms getting smaller, because, when we look around, we see Apple, we see Google, we see NVIDIA, right? And these seem like, pretty big enterprises, right? And the S&P 500 is very top heavy, right? We talk about the Magnificent Seven, and go across to China and you see, right, Tencent, and it's kind of doing everything, right? I mean, so can firms both simultaneously be getting smaller and larger? I mean, how should we be thinking about this?
No, they cannot simultaneously be getting smaller and larger. In terms of transaction volume, in relative terms, firms worldwide are probably getting smaller. They are spinning off assets and functions and activities, and at the same time they are also delayering. That I think these are the mega trends,
right?
And that it's not just Wolf's research; it's also research by Rafael Sadun, for example. She's also in Harvard Business School. That shows that middle managers are they're getting fewer in number. Let's put it that way.
Well, how is it that people? I mean, Jensen Huang has, I don't know, like 80 direct reports or something like this.
I think it's 60. That's the latest number I heard.
I mean, how can he do that? I mean, I'm astonished. I don't understand how it's possible even.
I mean, it kind of illustrates exactly what we're talking about here. You delayer, and NVIDIA, of course, is an extremely flat organization exactly in order to gain control of what goes on at lower levels, right? And Jensen can do this, presumably because he's a driven workaholic, right? He works 14, 16 hours per day, and probably weekends also. And he hates planning cycles, and he likes to pivot and in constant activity. But 60 direct reports, that is quite an impressive span of control, isn't it? Most managers have a much smaller number of direct reports, more like 10, 15.
Well, I mean, that must mean, that must mean that the bosses are doing different things, right? So, Jensen Huang is not coming in and offering a detailed set of instructions, right, to his managers.
I'm not sure, but if you look at Musk, to take another example, very related to Jensen Huang, basically, because Musk is also, of course, extremely hardworking and driven and so on. He does micromanage a lot, doesn't he? And the number of people he has fired over the years is amazing. So he intervenes, he overrules, he meddles, and most likely because he believes that he's in the know and they are not. And I guess oftentimes he's right and they are not right. I mean, if you read the Isaacson Musk biography, there are plenty of examples of exactly this.
Yeah.
Musk intervening in what seems to be small technical things that the CEO should not be interfering in, but he does. And that's part of his success, I guess.
Yeah, I know when I start off my organizational economics course, I talk about a world where, say, all of the subway cars are controlled from the center, right? And there's some kind of processing that happens at the center to make sure that the subway cars don't crash into each other, versus a world where there are, traffic signals, and the subway cars will kind of respond to these traffic signals. And, that's meant to be kind of a firms versus markets
Right.
distinction. But
Sure.
right, if those traffic signals are, the rules have to be designed in some
Oh
way.
yeah.
And so when managers are delegating to their employees some discretion, they're providing them with rules, right? And they have, transfer prices and overhead allocation, all this other stuff, right? And so, they're tapping into some market like mechanisms, but at the end of the day, they are designers of these workflows and these incentives. And so, do you think people sort of forget that? or
Oh,
or
absolutely, absolutely. So there was a great feature in Financial Times a few weeks ago about Disco, Japanese producer of machine tools for the processor and integrated circuit industries. And the title has something like a company that operates with a totally free market, something like that.
yeah,
And the impression is that's conveyed as there are basically no bosses in this organization. And it runs based on what you call signals. So there's an internal currency that they call wills, and you have to accumulate a certain number of wills over a given period of time. Otherwise, it's out. And you bid for projects that come with a
uh-huh,
specified number of wills. And it really is market-like because there's some kind of auctioneering system. So that demand and supply, there's market clearing, right? And I'm at Copenhagen Business School. We have something very similar. So I also have to do wills. I mean, in the sense of hours, I have to do a certain number of work hours per semester,
hmm
and I can do basically what I would like to do as long as I meet that pre-specified target. But other than that, I'm basically free to do whatever I want to do. That's also market-like, right? But designing that system is, it's been taken a lot of investments and efforts over the years, and the system, both here at CBS and at Disco, it has to be constantly maintained. Someone has to run it, not only set it up, but also maintain it. I mean, one of the things you really learn when you're a manager is that all those standard operating procedures and processes and routines that you put in place and expect be to run automatically and make the organization run automatically, they just don't. They tend to decay over time. You have to visit them, you have to maintain them, you have to invest in repairing them, set them up anew again and again. So the system architect or designer is crucial. No human system works itself or runs itself. It has to be supported, maintained. There has to be support, scaffolding, or whatever you want to call it, right? Same goes for phones and perhaps also for markets.
well, I mean, there does seem to be this pervasive instinctual aversion to bosses, right? I mean, sometimes it comes out of a I don't know, free market perspective, like
Oh,
an
yeah.
admiration for spontaneous order. But sometimes it also comes from sort of a more socialist perspective, right?
Right.
If you think
Right.
about the, Robert Owen and San Simone, and
Sure.
that still lives today in a lot of these enterprises. This view that we can all figure things out ourselves. I mean, have humans throughout history have had sort of a, I don't know, a fear, aversion, and discomfort in the presence of hierarchy.
I'm sure. I mean, there's always been reason to be a little bit afraid of the powerful, right? They may kill you factually.
Yeah.
Um, and a lot of the distrust of authority that we see, parts of which is healthy, I think, is fundamentally about emancipation, isn't it? And that is what unites the socialist angle on this, because socialism is fundamentally about emancipation. And we have the whole tradition going back to let's say the 1850s in England, worker-managed firms and the cooperative movement and so on, and fundamentally being about the emancipation of the working class. And then you also mentioned the modern-day libertarians, and of course they're also all about emancipation, from in a different way, from a different angle, to be sure, but the same kind of distrust of formal authority. And of course, libertarians will tend to distrust primarily state authority and government authority, but some of them have extended this to authority in firms also. So there's, for example, the founder of Morningstar, the tomato producer. What's his name? It's Chris. Is it Foss or something like that? Actually, I have a letter from him right here on my table, because he wrote to me about this book, which he had read. He wasn't in agreement, he told me, but he liked the book. But he has clearly designed his firm on libertarian principles. So that too, that in Morningstar too, there's a signal system, and you make deals with your peer employees, and you make a contract, and there's a system that monitors contract execution, like in a market economy. And apparently, Morningstar works very well. Although it's not a small company, it's like 10,000 full-time employees outside of the season, something like that. So it is doable to implement these market-like principles in even big companies. Disco Corporation, that I mentioned earlier, has 30,000 employees. Golf, which is one of the first companies to experiment with bosslessness, is also a big industrial company. So it's doable.
Yeah.
But bossless, no, that's not what they are. They have extremely well-designed structures and reward systems, task specifications, a very clear division of labor, extremely clear definition of roles, and that's what makes a very high level of delegation possible, and often a high degree of flatness also.
Well, I mean, I think you quote Herb Simon, who said, hierarchy provides some evolutionary advantages. I mean, when you look around, it's kind of hard to find these examples that you just referenced. And I think a lot of the people who are advocating for the bossless enterprise, they keep going back to the same examples kind of over and over again. And, if these were, leading indicators of a future, I mean, they've been a leading indicator for a long time, right? So it doesn't seem like this trend is growing. The other thing I think you reference is that these things are very, very dependent on the founder, right? And oftentimes when the founder departs, the enterprise kind of collapses.
Right. First, there's a lot of cherry picking in this literature. And I think that's true. There's very, very little, let's say, serious, large-scale statistical analysis. There's, emphasis on single salient examples like Valve and Morningstar and so on. And indeed, second point, these are companies that have been and still are heavily dependent on their founders. So the case of Valve, Gabe Newell, in the case of Morningstar, the gentleman I just mentioned. And you're also right to say that when they leave the company, typically, it changes its structure or even collapses. Another example might be Ricardo Semler, one of the first proponents of bosslessness, who actually did advocate for almost complete bosslessness. He was serious about doing totally away with bosses in his companies. And the third thing that you indicated is that in addition to the crucial role of the founder, there's also an issue to do with what are the tasks and what is the technology that we have in our company. And if you are a Morningstar and you basically produce tomato pulp, you have a very linear, I suppose, predictable, well understood technology where you don't need a lot of overview by a managerial layer, where there are relatively few interruptions, where things can be routinized to a large extent, and where therefore to a large extent bosses can step back. You just don't need bosses to the same extent when you're dealing with processes that are predictable, linear, and so on, right? Well understood. If we're talking Valve, at least Valve, before they became more of a distributor company, when they really were doing software development is something you can slice it up in modules, and you can allocate the responsibility for writing this part of the code to that team, that part of the code to that other team, and so on. And those teams can be, to a large extent, self-managing. And again, as a boss, you don't need to interfere because the team will handle it, and then towards the end, you'll have to piece together those software chunks, and of course, that's where the challenges emerge, right? But a lot of the process can be done in what may look like a bossless manner.
Yeah, I thought what was interesting is that you were suggesting that in times of crisis, right, where the world is changing rapidly and the enterprise needs to innovate, that's actually when you need kind of more hierarchy. I think a lot of people would think that it's in times of crisis and change that you need to sort of, I don't know, decentralize and, have your feelers out, right? And kind of, let the ideas come from the periphery.
Exactly. I mean, this is the conventional wisdom pretty much, that when you have, say, a society with a lot of change, there is a need for adaptation. And there's a need in particular for local adaptation. So that's all the libertarian thinking coming out of, in particular, Friedrich von Hayek and his thinking, right? And that is partly correct, but it overlooks, or potentially overlooks, that oftentimes activities are not isolated. And that you cannot have autonomous adaptation. On the contrary, you'll need coordinated adaptation, because when this changes, it changes perhaps in tandem with this. And that those two changing units, what they're doing needs to be coordinated by someone who knows how to coordinate. So if you are, let's say, for example, Bayer, to just drop an example, which is the biggest of the companies that we've mentioned so far. I believe it's 95,000 employees right now. Of course, it became particularly big as a result of the merger with Monsanto some years ago. But Bayer's new American CEO has introduced a radical bosslessness experiment. And from what I hear, and what I can read also, but I also hear things from employees who write me, that experiment is not doing particularly well. And I think the simple reason is we're dealing with a traditional industrial company with a lot of linear, highly interdependent processes. And if you delegate, and if you leave a lot of autonomy to people locally, there's a problem that your coordination will suffer as a result. So bosslessness, yeah, it works for some companies, typically those that have a more modular kind of underlying technology, where there's no high need for mutual adaptation between units or activities or processes, but it works much less well for a traditional industrial company like, for example, Bayer. And I think they're going to revert to a much more traditional hierarchical organization relatively soon. But let's see.
Yeah.
It's an interesting experiment, because they basically took Gary Hamel's thinking in the book called Humanocracy. It's basically the humanocracy recipe that they're trying to implement in Bayer. So it's a big test of that approach. Let's see how it pans out.
Yeah, I mean, I like to say to my MBA students that probably the most important thing that they're going to learn in business school is sort of, how to delegate, how and when to delegate.
Yeah.
And this is very complicated. It's not very easy. And there's an art and a science to it. And understanding exactly when to delegate and how to delegate and who to delegate to is their key skill set. But in addition to delegating downward, we also talk about delegating upwards, right? So, when you need coordination, that's when you need to appeal to someone, say, hey, look, I need you to align me and my colleague over there,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And and so and so I don't think this is something that people think of as a science, but it really is in a way.
It really, really is. Because in addition to the contingency factors we just talked about, like technology, how fast is the environment moving? How is it actually moving? Are we seeing radical change, or it's more like slow incremental change? In addition to these kind of contingency factors, there are also psychological factors to think about. So some employees like to be empowered, get autonomy. Others might like it less, actually. And some employees might like it because they think that you signal trust as a manager. They may also like it because that's their opportunity to prove themselves, rise in the ranks, earn more, whatever. But of course, there's also a potential downside to delegation, because you'll be held accountable ultimately, at least in a well-functioning company, right? That's a risk. And I'm just not sure that all employees necessarily like to be empowered. And bosses need to understand this. There's also there's also a set of issues that relate to perhaps less represented groups also. So, for example, there's research that indicates that women are less happy with highly delegated workplaces that are also very flat. And that minorities are also suspicious of such workplaces. It's mentioned in the book that you mentioned a few times, the book by Peter and me. And that's extremely interesting, because it kind of circles a little bit back to what you mentioned earlier, namely that we as a group can delegate power to you, right? And sometimes that delegation is very informal, like in the schoolyard or in high school. And it's not always necessarily the best people who get that kind of delegated power in the schoolyard or in high school, and perhaps in the workplace also. So I mentioned Valve earlier, which is one of the poster companies for the Bossless company narrative. And indeed, it is a very fascinating organization. In particular, perhaps if you go to Glassdoor and check out what ex-employees and current employees are saying about the company. A lot of them obviously like the company because it does give them a lot of freedom. But there are also remarks like, it felt very much like high school, right? You saw cliques emerging, informal power networks, and it wasn't obvious who was really making the decisions and who was influential and who wasn't. And what formal hierarchy with clear command and reporting structure, what it does give you is that these things are, well, that's just much more clear.
Well, I'm wondering, getting back to the original question about classical management education, what I've observed is that, courses like strategy. I mean, I'm just this week at the Strategic Management Society meetings, and, people are talking about sort of a crisis. They're worried that strategy is being phased out of the curriculum, and all of the stuff related to organizational theory is kind of, becoming less important. And I know at my business school at Berkeley, I mean, we don't have a management department. We have an organizational behavior department, right? And so there's a lot of emphasis on leadership and persuasion and inspiration. And all of the tools that you would use to motivate somebody, but there really isn't a lot of emphasis on, how do you design workflow and how do you design incentives and how do you, figure out the division of labor and so forth. And I'm worried that if we don't teach that stuff, right, then people will be kind of unprepared for the real workplaces in which they operate.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It, particularly given that companies, they redesign the organization all the time, don't they? They always tweak some reward system or add one unit, or spin off another unit, or merge two units, or close a department, or change roles and job definitions. And what you're saying is that many managers may be lacking the proper guidance for thinking about this. And I think that's exactly right. I think that we on the, let's say, more formal, big quotes, harder side of things, that we are also guilty of an omission, namely not paying sufficient attention to the softer stuff. So that if you look at the organization design thinking of the 1960s and 70s, Galbraith, Thompson, Lawrence and Lorsch, which is classical organization management thinking. The word employee motivation almost never come up. I mean, they're these docile puppets, and you just have to allocate them
Right.
to various functions in order to optimize the machine. Right, and that's almost equally wrong. So we've got to find a balance between the psychological aspects and the, let's say, more traditional aspects.
Yeah.
We talked about delegation, right? And I totally agree with you. And I actually told my students 10 days ago that the delegating is probably the premier management task, and also extremely difficult, because there's so many things that you have to weigh against each other, including a lot of psychological factors and issues.
Yeah, I mean, I find when I ask my students, right, why would you take a company and divide it up into departments, right, or divisions? And that, it seems like a pretty simple question, but I think it oftentimes dumbfounds a lot of students, right? Because they can't articulate why it would make sense to have, different groupings of employees. But it's kind of rudimentary. It's kind of basic.
It is extremely rudimentary. Again, on Monday next week, I'm going to teach exactly this with my students to drive home the point that, the division of labor, that's pretty much where everything starts.
Yeah.
Not just in Adam Smith, but also in the design of organizations.
Yeah. Well, and also, I'm teaching a course on agentic AI. And, of course, if you want to introduce agentic AI into the organization, you kind of have to understand workflows a little bit. And I like to say that the job of the manager is kind of workflow architect, which is you're kind of designing not only sort of an operational workflow, but you're designing a set of signals and a set of incentives, and you're channeling information flows so that the people who have to make decisions have access to the information that they need, and that's organizational design, right?
Yes.
I mean, you're crafting an organization.
When you talk about these things, you're also talking task allocation.
Yeah.
And you are also talking about who should carry out what tasks, basically. So you're talking about, for example, cooperative tasks. And you put people together, and they interact with each other, and they read each other, and your colleagues' motivation is going to spill over into your motivation. I mean, that's pretty well established in psychological research, right? So these, as you said, rudimentary issues about the basic design of the organization, they almost immediately have motivational implications, I think. So I get a little nervous when people only want to approach management from the point of view of OP and leadership, but I get almost equally nervous if people want to approach it only from the point of view of, let's say, 1960s, 70s organization theory, organization design theory. We surely we need them both. But we haven't been very successful, I guess, in bringing the two bodies of thought together. I mean, you're familiar with the idea that there's the fundamental divide between OB and OT, and supposedly OB and OT people never talk to each other. I have no idea, but that's what's being said, right?
Yeah, no. You still see that kind of cultural divide in business schools, right? Between you can kind of tell who is an economist and who is a
Oh yeah,
sociologist or psychologist, right?
absolutely.
Even within the organization, we're trying to figure out like, okay, we're trying to, I don't know, design a instructional point system for teaching, and the economists come down on one side and the OB people come down on the other side.
Yeah. And you have open-minded people like Oliver Williamson, Robert Gibbons, Ernst Fehr here in Europe, who basically said what I've just been saying, right? We need both sides. But I think perhaps that research interest is evaporating a bit. I don't see many people pursuing that program anymore, unfortunately.
Well, why do you think that is? Because I mean, it seems like it's becoming even more important than ever before, right? That you get this right.
One reason is that things like motivation are mushy and difficult. I mean, you have intrinsic, you have extrinsic, you have pro-social motivation. Motivations change, and psychology is all over the place when it comes to motivation. If you're an economist or say traditional organization theorist, it gets too messy because you want relatively clean models.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, organization design per se, at least here in Europe, is actually, and I think also in US, it's experiencing a bit of a renaissance at the moment. So there are a lot of PhD students who are working on organization design issues. And typically they are working on these issues not based on closed form formal models, but typically using simulation tools.
Right, because it's kind of hard to do kind of RCTs, right? So with behavior, I mean, you can kind of run these experiments to, tap into, I don't know, incentives and so forth.
That's true.
But it's kind of hard to say, oh, let's just design two completely different organizations
Yeah.
at scale and,
Yeah.
and then see
Yeah.
what happens.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. So what you're saying is it's empirically very difficult to research. And I think that's also right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe we could talk just a bit more about sort of, why this idea is so attractive. The idea of the bossless corporation. Why
Yeah.
people keep coming back to it, kind of
Yeah.
over and over again. Where's the appeal come from?
Yeah. So we talked about how it probably goes back a long time, right? At least 200 years, I surmise. It probably goes back to the Enlightenment ideas about emancipation, perhaps even earlier. And so it's something that is deeply rooted in our culture. It's also part of liberalism or libertarianism and socialism. So I think all these Bossless ideas, they insinuate themselves in our thinking because they appeal to some of our cherished beliefs that, the default is we're pretty equal.
Yeah.
The default is we should be free. We like autonomy. We don't like when the man, meddles in our affairs, right? So there are all these kind of cultural tropes or memes or whatever we want to call them that have been around for a very long time and were strengthened very much, I think, as a result of the 1960s counterculture.
Right. So you would say kind of the aversion to bosses is actually as a cultural thing. I mean, you would argue that it's kind of on the rise, right? So I guess, 100 years ago, people were more content to be bossed than they are now, potentially.
Yeah, they were probably more docile 100 years ago, more willing to
Like
take
the
orders.
company, the company man, right? In the 1950s,
company man,
just
yes,
like you go to work and you punch the clock and, you do what you're
Right.
told and you rise through the ranks and,
And if I ask my students to give an example of a workplace, a contemporary workplace, they wouldn't look to, the man in the gray flannel suit. I think we used
yeah,
that movie in the book, but they would rather drop a reference to the network, which is about, you know, um, Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, and totally different image, ostensibly at least, of what the workplace is. So
yeah,
Facebook, flat, networked, relaxed. We are wearing jeans, t-shirts, right?
yeah.
Certainly not gray flannel suits. So there has been this cultural shift to a very large extent. And will it continue? I'm honestly not so sure, because we do see signs among the younger generations that there's some kind of thirst is not the right word, but perhaps a weak longing for authority figures, perhaps spiritually. The whole
Yeah.
Jordan Peterson phenomenon, young men um, flock to his lectures. The almost worshipping of Charlie Kirk among many young people. These kind of things, right? The fact that apparently many young men are joining the Catholic Church. That there's some kind of longing for more
Yeah.
structure, perhaps higher values and authority, perhaps of some
But
kind.
but I think in a way, a lot of the people who are attracted to that think of themselves as rebels and free
Yeah,
thinkers. Right? So,
yeah.
but I mean,
That's the irony of it. That's absolutely true. Yeah,
so I mean, I'm wondering if this trend is part of people moving from uh, a deprioritizing of work, or is it the opposite? That people are increasingly looking to work for meaning. And so they want work to give them fulfillment in some way. That the man in the gray flannel suit was
yeah,
primarily working to support his family,
exactly.
whereas now work is your religion. It's the place you go for everything, and so it has to be. You're more demanding of it. You expect more from it, and you expect to be liberated through your work as opposed to viewing it entirely instrumentally.
And you're free to bring your authentic self, whatever that
Yeah.
exactly is, to the workplace. In fact, you're expected to bring your authentic self to the workplace, right? Yeah, that's also a big thing. And that's also something that the Bossless Company narrative has been able to play into. And I think you've been hosting Frederic Laloux on the podcast. And I mean, he's very new agey, and he links the workplace to changes in your consciousness and things like that, right? And and I think in his work, which is very interesting actually, you really see the 1960s influence. I won't call it new agey, but it's close enough, I think.
Yeah. But I think also, I mean, that gray flannel suit story, it's kind of a caricature, right? Because, as you point out, Alfred Sloan was
Oh yeah.
highly aware of the need to decentralize the organization, right? And delegate downward to a great degree. So it seems like it's sort of an empirical mischaracterization of the way in which firms have been operating all these years.
Yes, that's true. That's traditional hierarchy has a really bad press in general. I think an undeservedly bad reputation, because as you have pointed out, Sloan, for example, and many other businessmen, they operated with traditional hierarchies, but they were capable of combining relatively steep traditional hierarchical structures with often a lot of delegation, and it worked well for a lot of the time. Yeah, there are many caricatures here, and perhaps the notion of bosslessness that we attack in the book is also, as you initially suggested, is also a bit of a caricature, because who in their right mind can advocate for 100% bosslessness, right? Perhaps no one truly does that. But that doesn't mean that these utopia, perhaps, like the Bossless organization, that they do not have an influence in the real world, because they do.
Yeah.
I just mentioned Bayer, with a huge industrial company, one of the crown jewels of German industry, potentially, let's say, destroying a lot of value because of their choice of an organizational model that just doesn't fit what they're doing.
Yeah. Well,
That's a real danger of the Bossless Company narrative.
Well, I've been teaching courses on crypto for the last couple of years, last decade or so. And, what I found fascinating about this is not just the technology, of course, but the sort of cultural, meaning of this idea of complete decentralization. The engineers who come to this domain, they're really fascinated by the notion that you could have a completely decentralized and trustless way of doing things. And of course, when you try to execute on it, it's very difficult, right? So they're like, hey, let's just create a peer-to-peer system for car rentals, and we won't need Uber anymore. And of course, I mean, it's impossible. It doesn't work at all. And yet they're doing everything in their power to try and figure out a way to make it work, right? Because they really, really want a world where they don't have these centralized mechanisms. I mean, I don't know about you, but I find that world, the crypto world, is where a lot of these people wind up.
Right. Yeah, there's also various speculations regarding what the blockchain can do for organizations.
Yeah.
But perhaps we can also do away with, eliminate a lot of middle managers if we have a well-functioning blockchain, and all those speculations.
But of course they have to willfully ignore the fact that the code is controlled by half a dozen people who can just rewrite it at will, and that the mining is done by like 2 or 3 big mining pools, and that most of the crypto is sitting in the wallets of 2 or 3 big companies like Coinbase and Binance, and those are sort of just seen as irrelevant facts. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But maybe, I guess maybe where we can end is, I think, this is really a defense of managers. And you didn't mention this. I mean, I think in the book you mentioned it. Remember the Bullshit Jobs book, right? There's this notion that middle managers in particular are just taking up space. And it's hard for me not to agree with that, when I'm at a public university where I see all these people.
That's an excellent point.
Right? Who just, the more people you insert into the process, the less likely that anything will ever get done, right? And so it's easy to sympathize with this view of the bullshit jobs. Obviously, there's a degree of truth to that in a poorly run organization, but in a well-run organization, I mean, managers are absolutely essential, and middle managers perform a very important function. And I think you said something about managers being generalists in the book, and I emphasize this point in my classes. Getting an MBA, you're getting a PhD in sort of, generalism, in the ability to integrate information across a lot of different domains. So maybe just kind of give us a pitch on, why managers matter. Right? What is it that they're actually doing, this coordination stuff?
Well, they are doing a lot of good stuff. They are coordinating, and they are cooperating at the most abstract level. I mean, activities need to be coordinated in the sense of we have to figure out what those activities should be, how they should change in response to outside disturbances. Activities have to be linked. Activities have to be rethought. And once we have figured all that out, which is of course an ongoing struggle, then people have to be motivated to cooperate inside those and actually carry out those activities in the best possible way. And in a dynamic reality, this is a never-ending quest. Good middle managers have their hands full constantly, don't they? So I'm extremely worried about all these calls for removing, getting rid of all those middle managers. There's a funny calculation in one of Gary Hamel's books where he notes that In the typical bossless company, the typical span of control is, I believe, 1 manager to 10 employees, something like that, right? So they are flat because a given manager manages a lot of employees, whereas in the typical big US industrial corporation, the span of control is one to 4. Each manager manages 4 employees on average. And then he says something like, well, imagine if all companies in the US economy were run like the bossless companies that we do have in our economy, what would be the savings? And that's easy to calculate, of course, right? Because you just impose that all companies in the US economy, they have managers with a span of control of 10 employees. And I think the number they come up with is that middle management destroys or wastes on a yearly basis 17% of US GDP. And that's a fairly large number, right? But you cannot do this because it totally neglects that companies are different. Some companies may do fine with managers whose span of control is 1 to 10. Other companies may need each manager to supervise 4 or 5 or 6 employees, and that's just how it is. It's not that I would say that companies always get it right. Of course they don't. Mistakes exist. Bullshit jobs exist, not just in universities and the public sector in general because of government intervention. Bullshit jobs also exist in the private sector, but at least in the private sector, we have competitive forces that at least we can hope will weed out those bullshit jobs over time, right? So there's a tendency, I would say, in the private sector to get the layer and the number and so on of middle managers approximately right, as a tendency.
Right. So it's
it's not a Panglossian world where, what is efficient. That's not what I'm saying. But we have at least we have competitive forces that we can rely on to sort things out for us.
So it's kind of like junk DNA, right? Just because we don't have any immediately obvious, right, understanding of what it does, maybe we should think it's probably there for a reason, and maybe dig a little deeper. And if you get rid of the junk DNA, I don't know, the organisms might disintegrate.
I really like that analogy. I mean, those who really push the bossless company narrative, perhaps they need a little bit more humility. Perhaps things are there for a reason. Yeah.
Well, Nicolai, thank you so much for joining me. The book is called Why Managers Matter. So check it out before you start getting rid of all your managers.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well,
talk soon.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.